We make no guarantees, however, how long it will remain fiction.
Sprightly salutations to all you cognonauts out there, and welcome to another episode of Exofathom. I am Nick, and I'm joined, as always, with my two lovely co-hosts. Mike, how are you?
Oh, you know me. I'm hanging in there.
Fantastic. And we have, of course, Ayla. How are you?
Faye.
What?
It's like, hey, but I said Faye.
I like it. Okay.
Said, hey.
Yeah, Faye girl.
Yeah. God, I feel old. Yeah, no, I'm good. I'm good.
Good. Awesome. And we hope that you guys are doing well as well. Whenever you're tuning in tonight, we're going to be talking about fairies.
But Nick, hold on.
Yes.
How are you doing, good host?
How are you,
thanks,
glowy
guys.
man?
I'm not doing very well. This is going to be a hard episode for me.
Oh no.
We've had discussions before. We'll kind of break down the fourth wall here. We've had discussions before about how, like the best way to structure shows and all of that type of stuff. And I was working towards granularity and getting more specific about topics in an effort to sort of expound outward in the conversation and just be a little bit more focused. And I made the mistake of choosing fairies for this episode. And as you probably guys can tell, we haven't been recording in a couple weeks, and that's because of this episode. So all I can say is that I will be happy when I finish this, because it's just been a
albatross around your neck.
There you go. I like that. Yeah, it has been an albatross. It's been a fairy in my back. I don't know.
You've killed the fairy and put it around your neck?
Yeah,
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
so it's just, I was thinking that this was going to be a granular episode where we're going to talk about like the grim fairy tales or little things like that. But as soon as I looked into this, I realized that fairy just means whatever any culture wants it to mean, and so you're never like, you could call things like hobgoblins fairies. You could call elves fairies. You can call the djinn fairies. Yeah.
You can call a hobgoblin a fairy?
Yes, in fact, hobgoblins
there goes
were
my goblin episode.
Well, no, I mean, no, it doesn't, because there's a distinction here. Because
okay, so
like
hobgoblin.
It's like Fairies 101. Hobgoblins are like Fairies 201.
Right,
no,
right,
I already
exactly.
failed my section.
Subsection. Hobgoblins would have been the sort of evil version of the goblin, but goblins were also considered fairies back in the day, until they made the distinction that goblins were more negative creatures than neutral.
Right. So not just a hobgoblin. You're just goblins. Negative.
Goblins in general became negative, along with the demonization of fairies as well, which we'll talk about in a little bit.
Well, and can I just say, have either of you insulted somebody by calling them a goblin? I feel like that would be a good insult.
Calling them a fairy.
Yeah.
No, goblin. No.
No, I don't think I have. A goblin is a very specific insult. Yeah.
Well, I'm just thinking, like, you're like, imagine you're in traffic and someone cuts you off and you like flip them off, and then they go, oh, whatever, you got like hobgoblin or something, like, you mean, I don't know, just unexpected and funny.
I think if somebody called me a goblin, I might get into a car accident processing what the hell that was. Like, what are you? What are you talking about? How am I?
Or like, okay, where I see it being used is if you go to like the DMV and they're like, oh no, you need this specific document, so you get that document and you go to the DMV again, and they're like, oh well, see, this one has 2 middle names, but this has 1 middle name. They need to match. So you go there a third time, and then there's like another issue. So you go like expletive. Goblin, because the person in that case is, I guess maybe they're a troll because they're like blocking you. Anyway, it's just
goblins are smaller, but I think we'll get into the definitions of fairies.
Yeah,
Hmm.
I took us way off course. I'm so sorry.
That's
But
okay.
no,
You were
I
trying to tie it into goblins.
I have never called anybody a goblin or a fairy.
Well, I need
Yeah.
all the goblin insults in the comments. So if you're listening to this and you have a good one, please add it.
I don't know if they will, but yes, please.
Your dog
definitely
looks
do.
like a goblin. How about that?
Yeah.
Oh, she does.
More
Cute
like a
goblin.
gremlin. Yeah, so all of that to say that fairy really is sort of a catch-all term for a lot of mystical creatures, and I was able to sort of trace back some of the origins of the concept, and they vary from different cultures, obviously. But one thread that I found was that they were considered, I guess you could say, a cursed people, in the sense that in the mythology, most of the time, fairies sat out of the conflict between good and evil. And so they were cursed to sort of live in this parallel world that was not really attached to our world, but sort of like in between it or running alongside of it. But cursed to this sort of mundane world and shut paradise. And this ties back to a lot of different mythologies about angels and fallen angels. And you have like the Nephilim. You have this constant about characters who decide to opt out of the fight. And they're thus sort of cursed, doomed to exist in this worldly plane and never be entered into paradise again. And that's a through thread for most of the fairy mythology that I was able to find.
Would exile be the proper word for fairies? Like they're exiled out to their own little
Yeah,
world?
I think that that's probably a fair descriptor. Exile is good, yes, because they were divine creatures that once would have been accepted into paradise, but because of their inaction, were sort of exiled to Earth and having to stay here.
Do they have any like possibility for redemption? Because like you have beings in purgatory, right? That can,
Hmm.
at least if you have like the divine comedy, they have chance for redemption. I'm curious if fairies do.
Yes, in certain in certain beliefs. So in the early belief of fairies, it actually comes from the Iranian culture, and the book called the Shahnameh by Ferdowsi, which is a big 1,000-page book of all of the list of kings that ruled over Iran. And the fairies play a big part in some of the king's success, or different kings and all of that stuff. But the belief for the Peri, which is where the Europeans got the concept of the fairies, is that they were destined to stay on Earth until they made that redemptive process, until they proved their worth again in the eyes of God, technically. And so, yeah, that came around. So there, it's spelled Peri, which sounds a lot like fairy. But in the Shahnameh, it was written. This book's probably about 1,000 years old, and that's probably around the oldest description of fairies that we can find. But in this book, there is a tale of a king called Keyumars who has to fight the demon king Ahriman. And in this fight, he employs the armies of the Peris to fight alongside him, and sort of thus redeeming the Peris, at least the ones that fought with him, in the eyes of God, and was able to sort of vault them back into the heavens. Later on, Peris also played a role in King Jamshid, where he was such a great king and so divine that when he sat upon his throne, Peris would come and lift his throne into the sky. So you have this like parallel world with these creatures that are divine but also mundane and walking amongst us. You also have these callbacks to maybe even demonology, where you can sort of enthrall them or at least employ them, like Keyumars does with the army of Peri. He basically Keyumar is the king that fights Ahriman, which is the demon king in the Shahnameh. And he's sort of like, like in Lord of the Rings, where Aragorn goes to that group of ghosts, And he's like, he brings the
Gotcha.
sword to them, and he's like, fight with me and you'll be redeemed. It's kind of the
Right.
same exact scenario, where these Fairies are sort of destined to have to prove themselves in order to get back into heaven.
All right, I'm gonna need a better pop culture reference.
No, don't got one. Sorry.
Oh no, I'm SOL.
Yeah.
Goblin. No.
Goblin.
One of these days, I'll stay awake through those movies. Promise you, I'll do it.
One of these days.
Yeah.
That's okay.
What movie? Oh yeah, I'm like that with Interstellar. I want to like that movie, but I literally fall asleep. Like he's never gotten out of the cornfield, and I'm like, why is the cornfield like an hour long? This won't be over.
You're like, you're ready to change it over to like Children of the Corn. Like, yeah, this movie's probably better.
Yeah, might as well.
Field the Dreams. Yeah.
I didn't sign up for a corn maze. I want to go to space. Damn it!
What was it? The kid that would send the people to the cornfield in Twilight Zone? The little Timmy kid. If you thought bad thoughts about him, he would send you away.
Oh right, I think that was also Children of the Corn.
Yeah,
maybe. I don't know.
Well, I thought they just killed people. Anyway,
maybe. Yeah, they might have killed people. That's true. Yeah. But yeah, so the ancient sort of idea of the fairy comes from ancient Iran and the peri, and it's sort of historians think that it was adopted in Europe through the Indo-European slave trade, just the spice trades. So bringing the cultures from Persia, which is a very big empire back then, and then into Europe is where you get this idea of the fae or the fairy folk. But that could also just be a sort of like a descriptor for something that was already there, because we see in Scotland and Ireland, they have analogs to this as well. And indeed, most cultures in the world have an analog to a sort of in-between being, between the divine and the sort of mundane, that sometimes is cursed to walk amongst the humans, or is thrust into a cave, or is a troll or a goblin. But I think it could be a convenient sort of catch-all for the term fairy to seem like an umbrella for supernatural beings that live sort of parallel to us.
Oh, that's why Alo is like fae in the beginning. That was that the foreshadow? Am I getting that right? Okay, now that makes sense. It all comes together. I'm just slow. That's all.
Yeah, no, that was me, season 7 of True Blood. Whatever season they brought this in.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah, season 5 fairies are the reason why I stopped watching True Blood. I love the show, and they brought in like the fairy blood stuff. I'm like, why? What are we doing?
Oh yeah,
stop watching.
I think it was when he had like 7 fairy babies is when I was like, wait, I must have stopped paying attention because things took a really sharp turn and I'm so lost. Back to the fae.
Yeah, I totally remember that. And there are some parallels and some actual, folklore ideas within that show too. So the fae become these sort of creatures. I should mention that there's the Scottish version would be called the Seelie.
How do they spell that?
Seelie is Seelie. Sorry.
Seelie. Okay.
Seelie. Yes.
Oh, it's like I think the Irish also have the silkies, which is kind of like the mermaid, but it's like a it's just a seal, but
I don't know 100% if that's the case. I know that Gaelic is very hard to pronounce, and it's not spelled like you would pronounce it.
So. Trust me, I know. I know.
It's such a tough language.
Tough words.
But the Scottish believed in what was called the Seelies, and so this, or they were called whites as well. And there was a distinction between these classes. So they were sort of like divine beings of luck or happiness. But there was the Seelies and then the Unseelies. And the Unseelies were tended to be more mischievous and a little bit more trickstery. And those are the fairies that you have to be careful of. And so when we talk about things like what the fairies might do to humans. We can get into that soon, but there are protective ideas within this folklore as well. And it was thought that carrying wrought iron would ward fairies off. And usually they were in wrought iron or like iron charms that you would carry with you in order to protect yourself from fairies. And that specifically was an European idea, but you can trace that all the way back to the Iranian tradition again, because the Peris were preyed upon by the Divs, and the Divs were sort of the evil version of the Peris. And what the Divs would do would they would imprison the Peris in wrought iron cages. And so you have this idea that wrought iron is something that can imprison or ward off fairies. And you also have this idea of the Seelie and the Unseelie from the Scottish tradition, which means like the good fairies and then the bad fairies.
There is something very similar with warding off like demons in more Christian faiths, where if you have like an iron nail is used to crucify Jesus, you put it on your doorway, you kind of seal it off alongside the salt, of course. But yeah, no, it's interesting. And I know with Irish fairy, I believe in that folklore, you have like summer/daytime fairies that are helpful towards humans.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have winter/nighttime fairies that are more mischievous, that try to like lead you off the trail.
Mm-hmm.
And I find it interesting that duality exists throughout multiple cultures within this one folklore.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting, and this also this interesting is this to me is the concept of this inaction. So there's a sort of parable here with just the idea that the Fae folk are this cursed race, or the Peris being a cursed race, and it's due to their inaction. And I believe in the Peri section they say it really kind of interestingly. They say so they're saying that the Peris were target of lower level beings called the Divs, which I already said. This persecution, let's see. Oh, it was so the Peris basically were cast out of paradise because of their lack of sufficient self-esteem to join the rebellion against perversion. And so you have the parables with Milton or the parallels there with Milton and Paradise Lost. You have the fallen angels and Lucifer's legion rebelling against God. And then you have these people in the middle, or these angels in the middle, who don't choose a side. And they almost invariably all get sort of cursed to live lives on earth and never reach paradise again.
Damn.
Yeah.
Wait, so it's like you can choose a side and transition one way or the other, or you don't choose a side and then you're like stuck in this like lost space.
Yeah. And it's
Wow. It's like play the game or else.
right.
Well, only Sith deal in ultimatums. Reminds me a lot of like Grey Jedi, where they don't really pick a side.
Right.
But their powers are limited by both sides. Like they don't really get the Jedi resurrection powers. You don't get the Sith live forever powers. They're not really allowed to expand that far, but they can have it's breadth over depth in a weird computer science way. But yeah, no, it makes sense. I mean, if you choose to say Switzerland on everything, everybody's going to hate you because you have chosen to stay Switzerland.
Right.
Or like in Survivor, if you don't make an alliance, you're, first pickings.
Oh yeah, or like in prison. If you don't get in with your gang, you're going to end up dead.
That's true too.
Or in isolation.
Yeah. I did want to point out the sort of concept of inaction. And I think you guys hit on the head there, this cautionary tale of like, if you don't make a move, like you said, Ayla, that like you're going to sort of put yourself in a stasis. And stasis is I use that word very particularly because when we talk about the fairy world, you'll see that time isn't exactly the same as it is in the main world.
Also Zelda.
Also Zelda, Ocarina of Time?
No, stasis.
I thought
you were going to be like, hey, listen,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
No.
Fairy,
Well,
that's
Zelda.
funny.
I mean, I always thought Zelda was like a little fae creature person. And then one of his powers is stasis in the game, Breath of
Mm-hmm.
the Wild.
There's a lot of things I can say. I will bite my tongue.
Oh, yes.
All I'm gonna
Link.
say is, oh yeah, I don't actually. Okay, yeah, I probably, yeah, no, you can
But Zelda's
educate
an
me.
elf. That's okay.
Zelda is. Oh, Zelda's
Well,
an elf.
I'm not
Golly,
allowed
okay.
to like. I'm also. I've like played maybe like 25 minutes of all the games, but as far as the lore goes, let's just,
Yes.
you'll be fine. No, it's okay. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. It's fine. It's
Yeah.
fine.
You know where I went? I went pointy ears. Zelda has pointy ears, and for some reason, I think fairies also have pointy ears, and so I went, boom, Zelda is a
Mhm.
fairy, but he's an elf. Messed up.
Yeah. Well, so as far as we see the sort of good side of the fairy or the fairy, which is this force that you could sort of harness that would help you benefit against obstacles, there is also this adversarial force within the fairy mythology. And Mike, you had mentioned, I think we talked about this in your Jack-o'-lantern episode, but I think you mentioned the Will of Wisps, right?
Yeah, like a force.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So the fairies actually utilize the will-o'-wisps to make travelers lose their way. And it's said that when they did lose their way, they'd be snatched into the world of the fairy and never to return.
Yeah, you have
But
to turn your shirt inside out.
you just not look at it. Yeah.
There's
They told you not to look at it.
but I looked.
Yes,
I
you look. I know it's so
I
it's
wanted
so
to.
shiny. Yeah, for those of you guys don't know, the will-o'-wisps is sort of this like fiery, pulsating, I don't know, floating thing that is supposed to sort of make travelers stray from their course.
I'm tripping out over this overlay. Like, so I'm trying to figure out where it is. Sorry, because the bars, like if you spread your arms out, the bar. Keep going. You're fine.
All right, no worries.
It's just
no worries.
nerding out over.
Yeah, it's all good. Yeah, so let's see. There, I got through the Perry and the fairy. Some of the possible explanations that there were for the fairies was, again, I've kind of already touched this, but fairies as demoted angels or demoted pagan deities. Again, this concept of demoted being that they were thrust out of paradise because of their inaction. Sort of more modern Christianizations were that fairies were like demonic entities or even spirits of the dead. And then you have the explainer, which I think is probably the most widely spread. And they call it an outdated theory, but it's the hidden people theory, which is kind of what we're getting at here with this parallel dimension that they might be living in next to ours. But a lot of the belief was that fairies were living in a sort of a veil dimension that was overlaid on ours. And most of the time you wouldn't see them, you wouldn't interact with them, but there were certain places where you could, and that would be a big problem for you. Because if there's one thing that most people understood about fairies is that you don't step on their turf and you don't get in their way, or else they might snatch you up. And they particularly like to snatch you up and replace you with a changeling, which is a baby fairy that will grow into what you look like, which
Or
might
die.
be, huh?
Or die.
Or die. Yeah, sometimes it dies as a baby. Yeah, because a lot of the beliefs happened or circulated around childhood illness, and back then children definitely died at a much higher rate, and so it was thought that if your child died suddenly, it could have been that the fairy stole it and then replaced it with a dead changeling.
There was
Frightening.
a story of so within, I think it's Irish myth. If you took a changeling and put it in the fire, or any fire, like a fireplace, the changeling would escape and bring back the person that was lost. So there's these stories of these husbands who had
Throwing
wives,
babies into fires.
no, full-grown wives that felt like the
Oh.
wife was a changeling and would throw them into the fire, into a fireplace, in hopes that their real wife would be brought back.
Oh, very nice. I would like to see how many times that that the real wife was ever brought back. I would
Right.
likely say it was 0.
And then another thing, like where this runs in modern day lore, is in Halo. So you have the Spartans. The main character is Master Chief, that is a Spartan, genetically modified, and you have within their military structure, you have Spartan 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, and more. But 2 and 3s, what the scientist did, Halsey, she commissioned a group of people to kidnap kids when they were young and replace them with a clone that would die shortly after from some childhood illness. And then they would take the soldier and then genetically modify them and raise them as Spartans. So it's interesting how even like this sort of fairy lore of the changeling is still around in modern like storytelling, just in a different way.
And yeah, it's such a weird thing to be so, you know, prominent in our storytelling. This idea that somebody could be swapped out with somebody who's not them. Like, do you think that's just severe cognitive dissonance of a like unexpected death? Or, I mean, the only other thing I could think of is that there was some at point people were being swapped out with changelings.
Well, you also have the idea of like the doppelganger, right? Where, even if you don't die, it's like some change, some switch happened. It's like the evil version of yourself. I think it's just what happens when people don't have complete information. Like life's an incomplete information game, and all of a sudden you see this person take a turn for the worst, whether that be through behavior or in illness. And so your brain's going to do anything that it can to rationalize that and understand that. And I think that's where the changeling comes from.
Yeah, possibly. I think that that's a pretty good naturalistic explanation for something like that, for sure. I wonder also if there might be a condition or something that happened in which like people just lost recognition of children. You know, like maybe it was just like a mom would come home and be like, "That's not my child," and for whatever reason,
it could
be
also
lead poisoning
like,
or whatever. I don't know.
Well, I mean, like early PPD, right? I highly doubt that they knew what postpartum depression was.
Right.
And the mom gets freaked out about the baby and wants to get rid of it. And so just as a changeling, it was a changeling. It wasn't my kid at all. Just to
the fairies stole it.
Yeah, just try to rationalizing that sort of set of behaviors.
Yeah. So the other idea was that they could be elemental spirits, which kind of goes along the ideas of sprites and pixies and fairies, that they would be nature spirits that were tied to Mother Earth. As far as characteristics go, again, cold iron charms usually helped ward the fairies away. Also, bells. But in the Scottish folklore, the Seelie were okay with bells. It was the Unseelie, the sort of evil fairies, that didn't like the sound of bells. So you get this tie with like the demonic and church bells, and then that, you know, bad fairies don't like the sound of church bells, and that would ward them away. Another common warding tactic was to carry a piece of bread in your pocket, which was the style at the time. I mean, it really was the style at the time, because they thought that because the bread represented the hearth and industrialization, fairies were sort of repulsed by it. Them being naturalistic beings, this concept of bread being a mastery of nature, at least that's the way they thought of it, would be an affront to the fairy sensibilities. So if you had a piece of bread in your pocket, you're also protected from the fae folk.
This is sounding very like Christianized, because I think
a lot of it is, yeah.
I think like pre-Christian, they were very neutral spirits. Like they could be mischievous, they could be, like they could be mischievous but never demonic, and then they could help you but never angelic. Like
yeah,
extreme of Guru.
Chaotic neutral, I guess you could say, a little bit of the chaotic neutral. They did what they wanted, and that I think that ties into the sort of again this preternatural, which is like a parallel sort of the in between the mundane and the supernatural is what they call the preternatural. And that's where they say the fairies sort of live, which is this middle space where they're not divine, but they're also not evil spirits. So yeah, you're not going to get 100% out of them in either direction, which makes the interactions much more vexing than anything else, which I think which would sort of naturally cause people to steer clear of them, because most of the time you couldn't tell whether it was going to be a good interaction with fairies or a bad one.
Oh, you got to be a gambling human.
Right, you can be if you'd like, and so to this topic of the preternatural, or sort of like this crossing between the divine and the mundane, there are these things called fairy paths. But before we get there, Ayla, do you have anything that you wanted to add?
No,
Were you
no, I'm
right
just
there?
yeah, I'm here. I'm listening. Sorry, we had some I don't know, loud gunshot well, I probably find well, I don't know. There was just loud sounds and our dog kind of needed
out.
some attention. Yeah.
Yeah, I know, right? Yeah, so the belief in sort of the preternatural or the parallel universe was so deep in European, and especially within the English, the Scottish, and the Irish folklore, that there was a belief in something called fairy paths. And you had to be very careful about fairy paths, because fairy paths were basically the freeways for fairies. And there was a lot of problems back in the day if you blocked a fairy path, or if your house was in the middle of a fairy path. I was looking into this, and I found there was an instance of a farmer who actually like demolished a corner of his house because he found that there was a fairy path cutting through it. And so in order to keep the fairies happy, he knocked down the corner of his house that was in the way of the fairy path. And
Wow.
I'm like, they really did take this seriously. There was another story of a farmer who had 4 or 5 children, and 4 of them died, and one of them was very sick. And then came across a gypsy that told him that his house was in the path of fairies as well. And so he was able to remove the portion of the house that was in the path of the fairies, and the 5th child survived. So they believed that it was because of this fairy path, you're blocking the path. And so there was another instance in which this man who lived in a little cottage, he purposely, well, he didn't purposely, but he had his cottage where the front door and the back door were aligned, but it was also in a fairy path. And so he was told by a medicine woman, or maybe a gypsy woman or something, that all he had to do was keep his door ajar, his front and his back door ajar at night, so that the fairies could go through. So there's this whole thing. I have this whole page here. It's just like many different times that fairy paths were honored in order to appease the fae.
Did anybody try to catch the fae? Like, they're like, all right, I'm in a fairy path. It's time to set up a bunch of traps
And
then
evict
try to
these
catch-
fairies.
Unfortunately, the consequence of obstructing a fairy path was invariably death, each and every time.
Nice. Like,
Yeah.
Wow.
If you don't get out of the fairy pathway, you die. That's
There-
just what happened, apparently.
such
Yeah.
Consequences.
tiny but violent creatures.
Yes, yes.
Well, I think
yeah.
it's interesting just to mention fairy paths because, okay, so having not traveled to some of these locations, I can really only go off of like documentaries or photos that I've seen. But more recently, I saw a picture of a lake, and it was either in Ireland or maybe it was in Switzerland, but you know, it was on that general continent and area. And one thing I appreciated was this like low hanging fog and just this kind of these old growth kind of forests that have been intentionally left okay. And I don't know. I just think that there's certain areas where the nature is ripe for creating these types of pathways or creatures because there's like an auspiciousness. I can't say that word. auspiciousness about the area, you know, whether it's the fog, the lighting, the size of the trees, the air, the atmospheric pressure, so you're like out of breath when you're up there or something. But I do think that like exploring that magic of the natural world, and the more magic of it, the more you get this sort of like thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would like when you walk into a certain part of the forest and the whole feeling changes, right? Like everything. Um, yeah, like something. There's like something in the air, like some like the vibe, everything. All your senses just feel slightly different.
Yeah,
Those
and
are the fairy paths.
yeah, and I think, a lot of writers have remarked on this. Like I'm thinking specifically of Anne of Green Gables. This character with a very highly active imagination. And she goes down this path. It wasn't a fairy path, but they said it was like haunted. Don't go that way. But for whatever reason, she couldn't go the regular way and she had to get somewhere. So she goes through, and the scene in the book, it's kind of like she's just describing everything you would expect to experience in that situation, right? Like it's deadly quiet. You can hear the creaking of the trees in the wind. You can hear the rustling of dry, dead leaves. Maybe you can hear like things running in the distance. Like there's just certain things that writers over time have said, okay, these are the elements that create this mysterious environment. And like we can pick up on it. It's hard to describe, but there's a vibe. And you could be rational and be like, well, it's just me being scared, or you could be like, maybe there's something else here. And I like that sort of that's there, and there's all these stories about that, and like markings of like, oh well, that's a fairy path, be careful, like
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of cool. And I want to see maps now, go visit those places or something.
I would think that they probably do have maps in Europe that you could buy.
Wouldn't that be cool?
The partial silhouette of an animal that you think is a divine being or something like that, and you're like, "Oh, we'll follow this." You end up wandering into like a mama bear's nest, and you're like, "Oh, what have I done?"
Major mistake.
Right.
Which is, would end up in death. But yeah, there's
end up in death. But
yeah, but anyways, probably the worst kind. Like you end up as poop. Isn't that the worst kind of death? I mean, I guess we all end up. Yeah, fairy.
Or bear. Yeah. Fae. Well, and I googled fairy paths, and this book came up that says fairy paths and spirit roads. I guess it was published a little while ago, but it talks about how certain landscape features in Britain, Ireland, Mexico, and the United States have a lot of these qualities to them that have over time been identified.
Mm-hmm.
Most recently, there was a woman in Ireland who was trekking, and she started to hear a voice like out in the forest telling her to like, come here, follow.
Oh no!
Never do it.
No.
Like even if it's not a fairy, if it's like a human doing that to you. But what she did was like going back to the turning the clothes inside out, she took off her shirt, turned it inside out, and put it back on, and instantly the voice went away. So her thought was that it was like a forest fairy.
Yes.
Wow.
Those would be particularly called brownies. Brownies are extremely offended by articles of clothing. And so the inversion of the shirt would be to offend the brownies. They're also very offended. Like if you wanted to get rid of a brownie, you'd give them an article of clothing. And it's not that they don't like the article of clothing, but they're snobs. And they don't like crap clothing. They don't like crap, textiles. And so they're offended by all human textiles because they think they're shit.
Okay, so. Nice. I was going to say, that's why I shop at Walmart.
Yeah, so the brownies would definitely not be happy with you turning your shirt inside out. They think it's ugly enough. So yeah, that's pretty funny.
I can't give them my Molson Canadian shirt. They wouldn't wear it. They wouldn't rock it.
Nope. They don't want it. No, I guess they only wear magical clothing or something.
Next time anybody like I reach for a piece of bread and they're like, "Oh, gluten," I'll be like, "Oh, fairies." Just thinking like the other ways to stave them off.
Well, it would be interesting to see how cities were built in Britain and in sort of, you know, to see if they did actually avoid those fairy paths. Because I could see like the idea of cities, you
Mm.
know, being not a sole byproduct, but just a convenience byproduct of maybe avoiding fairy paths, especially in sort of ancient Britain, where this was very much a thing. Like you
Well,
just didn't build your house in a fairy path.
now what's really interesting is that some places the workaround has been to just build on top of the city, which I think is really interesting. I didn't know this, that there's certain areas around the world where there's a whole city under the city. And like the biggest crazy thing I never knew was that like Sacramento,
Mhm.
if you go to downtown Sacramento, there's areas where you can take a tour and they'll take you underground and you can see this entire city that's just been like abandoned and built on top of.
A lot of cities actually. Yeah.
Istanbul, six on
Yep.
top of Istanbul.
Paris. Yeah.
Right.
Paris.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah,
lots of
London came down and came back up again.
Mm-hmm.
There's a bunch of them.
And
Lots
so
of
yeah,
cities.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I just think it's interesting, like in some cases, the act that like you're not on the same exact level kind of null and voids the pathway, you know.
Or they were so afraid to build a city elsewhere because they knew that spot didn't have fairy paths. So they're like,
Oh,
right.
forget it. I'm
Hold
just
on.
going to build on top because we know
Hold
this
on.
place
If
doesn't have a
there's
fairy
like
path.
fairy airspace, they had to like go to like some
Oh,
government
man.
thing. You're like, oh, we got to build a
Yes.
little bit higher. Like, the airspace is between 0 feet and 10,000 feet. Everything
Yeah.
above that's fine.
Yeah,
Then
seriously.
does that
Air
become
rights
a
are a
fairy
thing.
subway?
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe.
But yeah, so that along, there are also something called fairy forts. So you have fairy forts and fairy paths. Now, fairy paths are the lines in which fairies travel, kind of like their freeways. Their forts are basically strongholds where the fairies live. And they're sort of natural occurrences. So if you've ever seen a group of trees in a circle, or you've seen a group of mushrooms in a circle, or any sort of plant that sort of naturally pops up in a circle, those are all thought to have been fairy forts.
Oh.
And those are to be avoided at all costs because if you don't die, you're going to get sucked into the fairy realm because they were considered portals into the fairy world.
Oh, that's like Nightmare Before Christmas then.
Yeah.
The circle of trees.
Mm-hmm.
What
That's
if
exactly right. Yeah.
what if I have
A
fairy
plus
friends?
for me.
Yeah.
If you have
10 out
fairy
of-
friends,
11 out of 10.
There you go.
11 out of 10.
Thank you.
Yeah, what if I got fairy friends and I want to go visit them? I can't go sit and meditate in a circle of Animascara mushrooms.
yeah, you certainly can.
Jesus.
There's really nothing stopping you. There might be something stopping you from returning. That's probably all. You know.
Well, and there is a part of me that's like, didn't we have all those mushrooms that popped up on our lawn? I think there was a bit of a circular fashion to them, and our lawn guy just like buzzed right over them. So
Well, that's
I
on
don't know.
him, not on us.
No, that's awful.
I'll be right
Should
back.
cover
I'm
that
sorry.
in landscape
No worries.
training.
I'm stupid and I drank too much and I need to use the bathroom.
No worries, no worries.
Watch out
Yeah.
for those fairies.
Right.
Right, you could have a pathway.
Good. So this concept of a fairy fort as well was sort of revered just as much as fairy pathways were. So again, if you had this outcropping of trees in a circle or a shrubbery in a circle or mushrooms in a circle, it was said that you don't go near it because that was sort of the entry or the fortress of the fairies, basically the gateway in order to enter their kingdom.
Oh.
It was also said that you shouldn't look fairies in the eye because they don't like it. They think that it's an invasion of their privacy.
A lot of people don't like getting looked right in the eye, or the
Yeah.
concept of like staring or like focus on. You know, there's lots of energy with the eyes.
Yeah. The sort of the parallels to the evil eye as well, where you don't want that focused on you. Fairies were said to be very specific about, it was the folklore says if you run into a fairy, you're not supposed to look at them straight on because they get very offended by that.
That's so wild. I just wonder how that stuff like takes hold, because I don't know. I mean, were people actually seeing fairies or were they just repeating the story of fairies
Well, see, and that's
over so many generations with no like for us, like we talk about Game of Thrones, right, in one decade, but 6, 7, 8 decades from now, no one's going to talk about it unless there's like a Game of Thrones part 2, and then it like comes up. But if these fairies reappear once, there's mythology, then they never show up again. It's interesting that we keep propelling the myth.
Well, unless they were showing up all the time.
Unless they were, I mean,
Right.
that's the case. I'm interested. Did you get research about sort of the appearance of the fairies?
Yes. So when we think of fairies, most of us probably think of diminutive creatures. That
Tinkerbell?
Tinkerbell is a good example. That would be a classic sort of idea of the fairy. That really started in the medieval era. Before that, fairies were considered normal human size, and their wings were either not existent or they had bird wings. So more close to angels than fairies. It wasn't until the medieval period that they became diminutive and given butterfly wings, and very specifically butterfly wings, because it was thought that fairies were connectors for the sun's energy to plant life. And so they needed to be able to connect with all of the plants. And obviously you see butterflies flitting on plants all the time. So butterfly wings eventually are given to the diminutive fairies. But it's said also that fairies can change their size at will. So if you think of Hook, remember Julia Roberts' Tinkerbell, she was able to grow back into size. It was actually thought that the diminutive size was a voluntary one, that normally they were human size, but if they wanted to, they could shrink down to very small size.
And I know that you covered the Tinkerbell fairy, you got the human-like fairies. Prior to that, I've seen images of, like you said, like the hobgoblin fairies, where they're a little bit more grotesque looking, or something like that.
Yeah, those get mixed in with, I guess, so there's more Germanic stuff, which is more close to a little bit more grotesque, a little bit more goblin-esque, gnomes, goblins, that type of stuff. The Peris and the fairies were specifically supposed to be beautiful, because they're supposed to have a sort of enough of an element of the divine in them that they are appeasing, but not so much that they look like, gods or angels. So they were said to just look like very attractive people. Yeah.
And not like the biblical angels, not like
right. Yeah, not the
wheels
wheel
on
of eyes. Yeah.
Maybe that's why they have private security in Beverly Hills, where like all the pretty celebrities live. Don't go down that pathway.
Yeah, that's a fairy path.
Yeah, fairy path. No.
Silly.
There's no liquor stores over there. That's the problem with that area. I can't go over there. I can't go buy it. I got to like travel far just to get some booze.
Oh, it's wine tasting over there. Your
specialty
whiskey spot.
Yes. Everybody has a wine cellar there. So
Yeah.
But it has to be specialty. That's the thing.
Okay.
Well, to sort of. Oh, go ahead, Mike.
Did you get into bogans and like house goblins and that sort of stuff?
So hobgoblins and house goblins are pretty close to each other, and they would fall under the category of fairy technically, but I would consider them their own thing. Just like shoemaker elves and gnomes, I would consider their own thing, because fairy just becomes too broad, and then we're talking about elves and gnomes and goblins and then it's like leprechauns, and then it's like, okay, what are we really talking about here?
But those bogans are cool though. They're like, they get mad if you like move something in the house, and they're like, all right, now I'm just gonna stalk you for the rest of your life and ruin everything in your house. Right.
Yeah. There's a high level of mischief too, and fairies were to say like they would often steal small things from you all the time. So if you're said to have been losing something, it was thought that the fairies had stole it from you.
Hey, Lex. What is it that in an early episode we talked about like losing your car keys and you had to like search around your house for it? What if this whole time it was just a fairy that got mad at you and like snatched it?
It could be.
I told you there were mushrooms on our front lawn popping up in a circle.
And
It's
that whole
fairies.
time you couldn't find your keys to get out.
Yeah.
Nope. And the gardener came and everything was fine for us,
Yeah.
No.
Well,
There it
we
is.
laugh about this type of thing, and we think that it's kind of silly, but very serious stuff here, you guys. I don't know if you know this, but there was a secret occult group called the Fairy Investigation Society. Did you guys know this?
What? I feel like a sound effect is needed here.
Yeah,
Yes,
I forgot. The Fairy Investigation Society was founded in 1927 by Captain Sir Quentin Crawford, MBE, which
Wait,
means that
Captain Annisser?
he was a member of the British Empire. He was
This
very
guy.
high ranking. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, we definitely need some.
La-di-da.
We definitely need some like meaning wave phaser sounds happening here.
And he was an avid fairy believer and enthusiast, and it kind of came with the rise of spiritualism in around the 1840s to the 1850s. And we talk about theosophy and seances and all of that woo-woo stuff that got really big back then. This is sort of in that movement. But the history of them is that they were a dedicated secret society looking for world evidence of the existence of fairies. And they were around for, I believe, 40 years, 50 years, from 1927 to about 1955-ish, 56. So they were around for quite some time, and they had kind of a newsletter almost, where they circulated evidence to each other about the existence of fairies. And
Rad.
yeah, absolutely. And they had some notable members.
Oh.
Yeah, one of the adamant members of the Fairy Investigative Society was none other than Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote all of the Sherlock books. He was a very big member of the Fairy Investigative Society. He was so convinced that the fairies exist that he was just a really big member. He loved the concept of fairies, and he dedicated a lot of his time trying to prove the existence of fairies.
I wouldn't mind reopening like an American side, like that sort of thing, but here in the States. But the only rule is that it has to be like a neo-noir thing. Like I have to have like my wooden office, and I have to be able to smoke in it.
Yes, very Cloak and Dagger-esque.
Yeah.
The cloaks required.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, speaking of American membership, you might be surprised about this one. Another notable member of the Fairy Investigative Society was Mr.
Abraham Lincoln.
No, Walt Disney.
What? Stop.
What?
Well, it makes sense. He made
He was.
what?
I'm sorry. He was
Yeah.
jumping in all the 3-letter agencies. It didn't matter what it
He was a fan of all the
right?
secret societies. Yeah.
He was a social culty butterfly. No,
Yes.
a social secret butterfly.
He
Secret
was
social
also
butterfly.
an FBI agent for a while.
Was
Mhm.
he really?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Ah.
Yeah,
I like
and,
how it's a semi-secret occult group. Just semi-secret.
Semi-secret. Yeah, it wasn't fully secret. You had to be invited, of course, but
if you know about it, then it's not a secret, right?
right. But yeah, Walt Disney
Right.
apparently he went to Ireland to do some investigation for an animation that he was going to do. And during his trip, he was inspired by the folklore about fairies, so much so that he joined the club. He joined the society, and I would assume a lot of his interests sort of parlayed into his animations as well. We can think of Tinkerbell as one of the most iconic Disney characters that was, sort of animated.
Oh,
Now, though
Sleeping
Peter
Beauty.
Pan was a book, yeah, Sleeping Beauty, yes, the fairies in Sleeping Beauty. Then you have Cinderella and the fairy godmother. Lots of fairies in Disney works. For
I'm
sure.
sold. Sign me up. Send me to Ireland, and I will navigate everywhere and find every fairy fort that is required.
I will drink enough until I start to see fairies. How about that?
We're almost there. We're not
Yes.
quite there yet.
Yeah,
There we
maybe
go.
that's
Buy me
why
the
all
bottle.
these.
No, continue. Ayla. I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say maybe that's why all these fairy stories are coming out of Europe. There's a very
Yeah. Well, you have
specific thing that was imbibed.
Well, you also
Well,
have
you
the
think-
absinthe fairy, right?
That's what I was gonna say.
So-
The green fairy, associated with absinthe and wormwood.
But what
so-
I've heard is that the hallucinations aren't that strong.
No, not anymore.
I think
They
it was
took all
back
the
in
good
the
stuff out
day
of
when
it.
they had like
Yeah.
mercury and stuff in there or whatever.
I think they were probably putting opium in there too. So you would get very high alcohol and wormwood content with some opium.
Like I'm
It's
trying to
good.
like the last time I took hallucinogenics, it took a lot, and I had to stare at a completely white. I was reading white paper research because I'm a nerd. I research when I'm high on hallucinogenics, apparently. And then it was only after that I got to see like little fractals. So if there's any drugs or any of this stuff involved, I imagine it's high doses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they didn't work out dosing before. It's like they didn't really know a whole lot about dosing, probably. So yeah.
Yeah, they were just like, just take it all, just drink the whole bottle, you'll be fine. Drink this whole bottle of wormwood.
Yeah, you'll be all right. You might see a little green fairy, but you'll be fine. Don't worry about it. Just don't fall to them to fairyland. And that's kind of Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, please.
I wonder if the idea of the fairy was introduced before any sort of substances, or the substances started to introduce the idea of fairies.
That's a good question. As far as I could tell, there are some parallels with the Elysium Fields and then like the Eleusis Mystery School that might have some connections to it. But then you also see in medieval work the heavy use of fairies with Amanita muscaria mushrooms. I mean, they're illustrated around those mushrooms at almost all times. So you probably could bet that there was a parallel there for sure.
So for our listeners that don't know, we've done episodes on this. The Elysium Fields, if you visit our episode about Hades, it's sort of the heaven of the underworld.
Mm-hmm.
The underworld was just, you could replace it with the afterlife. And then Animascara, if you visit our episode, did we do an episode on berserkers?
No, but I think we mentioned it somewhere. I just don't remember where.
Okay, so Animascara mushrooms were the main mushrooms that berserker Vikings took. And these berserker Vikings would run into battle basically naked, believing that they were some other animal. It gave you a different kind of mushroom high that the common day psilocybin-based mushroom would. And I just wanted to add it that context.
And a very intense compound as well. Amanita muscaria is a very intense, so you see that imagery with fairies and the mushrooms. So I would say that there's probably a good connection there. What up, Big Mike? Salutations to you, man. Thanks for checking us out. I hope you're doing well.
Yeah, what up, Big Mike?
Yeah.
Hello.
Send us some money. I need to,
Send us all your money.
yeah, I need to buy some coffee.
No, we need to start a
all fun,
chapter of the Fairy Investigation Unit.
There you
Clearly.
go. Yeah, absolutely, we do.
I'm so down. And invite some elves.
Yeah.
20-year elves. Some
Yeah, why
Zeldas,
not?
some Links. I'm down for it.
I like it. So last little part I wanted to talk about is that we've talked about sort of fairies and the warning signs and this sort of parallel world. But I wanted to talk about the fairy world itself. And there's not a whole lot that you can gain. There is a sort of notion that it's a parallel world to the earth that we live on, but nothing it jumps out too much that would differentiate it from what you would see as just a forest, a beautiful forest or something like that. There are two big distinctions I could say I found. One, here we go. Mike just sent us $1 billion trillion. We are rich, guys. Thank you.
Nice.
Billion trillion.
This will make Exofathom the greatest podcast
ever. Yes, it will. And it'll be worth $10 in a couple weeks. So there you go.
Yeah, well, what can you do? We try.
Wait. We'll spend it now. We'll spend it.
Yes.
I was already
Real quick.
planning in my head, like, Fairy Path Expedition,
Mhm.
lots of field trips.
You got to go
There you
quick.
go.
You got to buy those tickets now. First class
Yes,
tickets, all of
exactly.
them. We got to move fast.
Oh.
Try to avoid Ryanair if you can, but if worst case scenario is that we break our spine. But we can
Emergencies.
figure it
Yeah,
out.
just emergencies. But yeah, I wanted to talk to you guys about the fairy world. Again, there isn't a whole lot of differentiations, but there were two major ones that I could find. And this sort of spans all of the folklore of the fairyland. And it is, and actually, in fact, the word fairy means realm of the fae, because airy in Gaelic is realm. So you have, and then airy. So you have the realm of the fae. So you could call fairyland just fairy if you would like. But the big distinctions I was able to find is one, if you do venture into the land of the fairies, you do not drink water or eat anything. If you do, you're done. Eating from their world will make you permanently a part of their world, and you'll never be able to come back to our world ever again.
Does it turn you into a fairy though, or are you just like a human in fairy?
I don't think it turns you into a fairy. I think it just destines you to their realm forever, in which case they'll probably kill you anyway. So, you won't be around for very long.
Man, that sounds like a pretty relaxing death. I think I have to look. Sorry, continue.
A tiny little sword's just stabbing at you.
Just little
Lilliputians.
Hey, it can't be worse than the Gauntlet.
Gulliver's Island.
The Gulliver's Island, right? Yeah, it's pretty good. But it can't be any worse than the Gauntlet, right? The Gauntlet's pretty awful. You got a bunch of langshirks, a bunch of long spears just stabbing you in the side as you walk down the road. That's what humans do.
Yeah. That's pretty civilized. But yeah, so this one really struck me because it reminds me of our Greek mythology and the waters of Lethe. The waters of Lethe in Hades were said to basically absolve the mortal of all of their memories in order to keep them in the underworld forever. So if you were to drink from the waters of Lethe, you were to leave your mortal world and your mortal life behind, sort of destined to stay in the underworld forever.
I'm pretty sure that's what this is, right? Some like good
Spirits.
tequila.
Yeah.
Some
waters of Lethe. That's all. So I thought that was kind of interesting because that would harken to this concept of the other world or the underworld and the fays sort of inhabiting that as well. Not to drink from them or eat from them because doing so would sort of destine you to that realm forever.
Yeah. No, that is interesting because you should want to return to the land of the humans, right? And if their only goal is to kill you, then you obviously don't want to be there.
Mm-hmm.
But then, like from a pessimistic point of view, you're gonna die anyways. So would you rather die in the land of the humans or the land of the fairies? And then it becomes like a personal choice of liberty.
What if it was the fairies from True Blood?
Luckily, I forgot everything bad about that show and kept on everything good.
There you go.
You know what? Good. I would just say, well, because what's her name? The main character is the fairy, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll let her kill me any day of the week. I'll be happy with that. I'm fine with that.
All right. Fair enough.
You can slaughter me and I'll be quite happy with my life.
Right. And then the second common denominator I could find within the sort of realm of the fairies throughout mythology is this weird sort of time dimension or time metric. So time moves differently in the realm of the fae. And I think the best, clearest example that I could find of this was Neverland, Peter Pan. Neverland's a very good representation of what the fairy world would be like. So in Neverland, the idea is that if you leave the mainland, which is what they call world in Peter Pan, and go to Neverland, you could be away from the mainland for 12 hours, but experience something like, 6 months in Neverland. Because time is moving at such an accelerated rate that you could spend a lifetime in Neverland and only be gone for a relatively short amount of time in the mainland. And same thing with the fairylands. The fairylands have this very weird time dilation effect that if you do enter there is going to be a strange time aspect to them.
Yeah, the only question is if you age during that time.
Right.
Like if you age at the normal way, right? Like you're only gone for 12 hours, but you age 6 months. That is reminiscent to being stuck in a moment of your life. Most common is, in my opinion, is like heartbreak. Like you have no idea how many friends I've had to talk through. Like, no, man, just go ask her. No, like years after a breakup. Like,
Mm.
just ask her out. No, man, I'm still
It's the hurt.
so
Yeah.
so. Yeah, the hurt. So that whole loop process ends up being stuck in their head for such a long time that they've aged, but they haven't really moved forward in time per se.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what
Yeah.
that makes me think of, and that's sort of a hell I don't wish on anybody.
Right. And that's where I wanted to bring up this idea of the curse and the curse of the Fae, because if you think that this realm is fun, I don't think that I don't think that you're right. I think that you might realize that you've thrust yourself into some sort of weird temporal hell. Because
Hey.
yeah.
If you're a masochist, it's a lot of fun.
Hey, yeah, sure. Yeah, that's true. That's true. But you know, in the concept of Neverland, you do have this overarching idea of arrested development, not wanting to grow up, and that ties back to this sort of stuntedness you feel after emotional trauma or emotional hurt. And so, yeah, there's deep parallels to there and how we would perceive time in relationship to that. But
Yeah, and depending on some uh some people like end up in fairyland without knowing they're in fairyland and have to. So like I don't think it's a one-way road. I think you can work your way out of fairyland back here, but you have to realize you're in fairyland.
mm-hmm.
And once you realize you're in fairyland, you can start to fast, start to not drink the water, and start to push yourself back into the human realm. I don't
Right.
necessarily agree with the folklore that it's a one-way road.
Yeah, I would akin it to a little bit more like Odysseus and the Lotus Eaters, where Odysseus travels to the island of the Lotus Eaters, and it's just this population of people who are eating lotus and getting drunk. And Odysseus and his crew find that they spend a year there without even realizing it because they're having so much fun getting drunk and stoned. That he wakes up finally and realizes that it's been a year. I think it's been even more of an absurd amount of time. It could have been like 7 years or something like that, because Odysseus's trip is ridiculously long. But yeah, he gets stuck there because there's this siren's call to the pleasure, to the arrested development, to not having to worry about the externalities of life, being put into that middle state where you're not quite in heaven, but you're not in hell either. And that becomes very, puts you in the stasis.
True. And that usually feels like a tequila hangover when you come out of the stasis.
Yeah.
But one, Dionysus would have some issues with this whole fucking argument.
I'm sure he would.
And two, it's very similar to what is that in 1984? The drug that everybody takes to pacify them.
Oh, Brave New World, Soma.
Oh, yeah, Brave New World. Sorry, not 1984. Soma, or any whatever your drug is. It can be anything from an actual substance to an emotion to a thought process. Right, all of those can be considered drugs. Or if you get stuck anywhere.
Yeah. And the Pleasure Island too, right? And like Pinocchio, this concept of being at a place, and Neverland in it itself. Neverland is this device of pure fantasy and imagination, this idea that you're shedding yourself of all the responsibilities of actual life, and you get to go live out the fantasies of your imagination. And Mike says Percy Jackson did a good representation of the Lotus Eaters at the casino. Yeah. And the casino would be a great place to represent that in a modern setting, because you're trapped inside the walls. There's no telling the time. There's no clocks. And you just got a whole bunch of pleasure being shoved at you at all times.
That's why I pushed back. I was waiting for you to read that thing.
Yeah.
No. Like Winks. But there's good ways though where this is done. So like look at craft, right? Like when you're making a knife, you can't tell me that for you time is not suspended.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, absolutely. I think that there's there's just a just a cautionary idea about the prison you can put yourself in when you overindulge. I think that that's what it is. We all know that our overindulgences end up owning us at some point.
can work be an overindulgence?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's workaholics all over the place, to the detriment of their, relationships with people, to the detriment of their own health. People just work themselves to death. Yeah, I
So
just think it's a human impulse to sort of push it to the extreme. We
I
like
think,
to do that.
but I find this sort of line of thought intriguing, like a fairy path. Is like the workaholic thing a fairy land, and should people follow it?
I think the qualifying ideas of a fairyland would be something that looks good from the outside, but then has hidden perils beyond it. So you just like Neverland, it's a beautiful, serene island that looks like a paradise, but then you get there and there's crocodiles that want to eat you, and pirates that want to kill you, and Native Americans that want to kill you.
Chasing the wagon.
You just crossed a fairy path, my friend.
I did. Sorry.
Don't worry, Ayla. I wasn't riding in the wagon. I was the one chasing the wagon on the side. So I'm right there.
Yeah. I think you could
heard?
find. Oh, what did you hear, Ayla?
I was just gonna say, we heard you said wagon. They're actually now making an Oregon Trail movie of some kind.
Oh my god!
Geez. Everybody better die of dysentery if they
I
don't.
mean,
What's gonna? Yeah, I mean, there's like 6 things that can happen to all the characters at any given time.
Pretty
How many
much,
rivers are they
yeah.
gonna have to like cock the wagon and move?
Somebody
it
got
across
bit by a rattlesnake.
every single
That
time.
happens.
Every time.
Yep.
No, but this workaholic thing is intriguing. So let's say I'm working on the way of curing, I don't know, world hunger, cancer, something like that. So you're saying that if I work 16 to 20 hours a day, actually having a path to solve this problem, right? Which just hangs forth the fairy world, the fairy path, kind of diving into this imaginary world. It is filled with other companies that are trying to do the same thing and take that sort of research. But at the end of the day, we shouldn't follow this road because it's going to be bad both for me, say the CEO or the lead engineer, fucking however you want to construct your argument. But it's also bad for the rest of humanity because they're also going to follow a similar road. Am I that's right? Like I mean, now I'm pulling all of humanity down the fairy road. Or down
Right.
the fairy path.
I think I just think of it as sort of a siren's call, right? Like, I don't know if necessarily it's a bad thing, but I think that if it comes to the detriment of self and the end result is your own self-destruction, that's where you start to see these parallels between the sort of facade and then the true danger that might lie behind it. So the concept of the fairyland is that it's idyllic and paradisical, but if you're immortal there, you most likely will die because there is a lot of danger. So if you're working yourself 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, and you're really working for a good aim, there's nothing wrong with that inherently, but it does end up being your undoing if you don't succeed. And so there is a way out of that fairy path, but it has to be, success. It has to be the ending of that process that, like you said, taking yourself out of that path, recognizing that you're there, and then trying to work your way back. So maybe if you do like a Hansel and Gretel and leave yourself some breadcrumbs, you find a way out.
What if the end goal is self-destruction? Take like the Jesus.
Then it's a success.
Right?
Yeah. You can do that. I mean, if that's what your end goal is, sure. Why not go out in that sort of blaze of glory? I don't see anything necessarily wrong with that. But I would say that there is something intrinsically wrong about being sold a false bill of goods. And I think that that's what the allure of something like Neverland does. Because even the children that go to Neverland realize you have the Lost Boys who get lured there over the idea that they can work their imaginations to whatever they want and they can be anything that they want, but then they end up realizing that they miss their mothers, but their mothers are long dead and they can never go back.
Is the difference? Is there a difference between Treasureland and Pleasure Island?
Oh, Neverland and Pleasure Island.
Yeah. Pleasure Island. Because it seems like Pleasure Island is the place where you get caught in that loop.
Yeah. Well, Neverland is too. Neverland is, I mean, like the story is that you're getting lured into this world where your imagination. So in Neverland, anything you think of actually will happen. And that's why if you've watched Once Upon a Time, that TV show, Peter Pan's character is super powerful because he lives in a world where everything he thinks becomes real. So Neverland has that pull for kids. I don't have to grow up. I can do anything I want, but at the loss of all of your familial connections. Your parents will be gone, your family will be gone, everybody will be gone. Pleasure Island's very similar. Pleasure Island is, let's go to this place where you don't have any responsibilities. You can play games, you can gamble, you can smoke, you can drink, you can hang out with all the boys and be jackasses for as long as you want, but you never come back a human. You always come back a jackass. So yeah, there's that cautionary tale there. There's maybe a little bit of Puritanism in it, but I don't necessarily think it's wholly incorrect.
Do you think there's like the journey of the hero sort of thing, right? You have to go to the underworld.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think you have to go to Pleasure Island and Neverland and make it out in order to be a proper human being?
I think that, yeah, you can definitely integrate that process into your sort of psyche and your persona. There's a lot of things that we don't want to grow up about. If you try to apply, what am I being a Peter Pan about? What am I sort of being in denial about? Yeah, you can certainly sort of integrate that and figure out a way out of that system. Or, what am I overindulging in? What am I being a jackass about? Yeah. But like you said at the beginning, it's about recognizing you're in that place in the first place, or else you're just going to be there forever.
Yeah, what I find really intriguing, though, is that like now we've almost made the fairy world a substitute for the underworld. That
in a lot of ways it is.
Yeah, that you have to go through that land and then go through this period of indulgence and then fasting and aesthetic, but not in the beauty sense, but learning self-control, I guess. The word's escaping me because I'm being a jackass and drinking too much.
but yeah, you can think of it as hell with the heavenly facade, or or heaven with a hellish facade, or whatever. It's like it's
the good place.
Yeah, the contradictory. Yeah, the good place, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, you have to work your way out of it, but it's necessary for proper maturation of a human being to go through this.
Mm-hmm.
Which it explains why so many cultures would have this sort of story, because if the story of the underworld is so prevalent, then the story of the fairies would also be prevalent.
Mm-hmm. That's why you have to be a Wendy Darling in your own story, because she makes it out. So There you go. Yeah, that's all I got, guys. Anything you want to add, Ayla? You good?
Yeah, I'm good. Just listening. Fairies. I think because, like you were saying, how it was a hard topic to research because there's so many different types and stories, and it doesn't seem like there are many ancient prominent fairies, right? So like we have Tinkerbell, we have modern iterations of fairies with personalities, but I find it interesting that in the lore there's not like, Timmy or
yeah,
I don't know, Flower.
Timmy the fairy
Who the hell is Timmy the
from
fairy?
ancient Babylon.
Well, I don't know. I mean, like that's what I mean is like there's no like household fairy name, and that's where I think it's really interesting that
there is a household Perry name though.
Perry name.
Yeah, a Perry. So again, the Iranian fairies.
I'm sorry. I know. Huh? I remember that part, but you're talking about the specific one.
Yeah. So the name Sarush. Sarush is one of the main fairies that comes down to help King Kayumar's fight against, or he's the herald basically. He comes and warns Kayumar's of the Demon King. So that he can help get the employ of the fairies. So Sarush plays a big part in the Persian mythology. But yeah, you're right. There isn't like a solid, name.
Yeah, and even in that case, it's just second fiddle to the king. Like I want like
like origin story, Marvel style for different fairies, and I know their names and like all that stuff. But but
You better
interesting.
trademark that real quick because they're gonna take it.
Right.
And they're gonna start making a whole
Extended
Pantheon.
universe.
universe.
Extended universe.
The face EU.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and you know what I think is interesting, because you talked a little bit about the like time disparity that pops up, but well, you kept bringing up this concept of like the fairy world apart from our world. This concept of like worlds being blended, and I think that that's kind of a notion that you see come up a few times. Like I don't know, like in some modern horror films, you have like interdimensional beings or tulpas or whatever, things that are kind of in this reality and not. And
The
yeah, I don't know.
preternatural.
The what?
The preternatural. That's what I meant when I said preternatural. That's like to describe that weird in between the metaphysical and then the normal world. Yeah.
Right. And I just it's just funny to think that humans for so long have acknowledged this thing, this other
Very
sort
long
of
time.
world.
Yeah, very long time. Like a parallel world.
Oberon.
Yeah.
Yes, A
The
Midsummer
king of the
Night's
fairies.
Dream.
Mike, we're gonna make you recite A Midsummer Night's Dream now, since you dropped the reference. Yes, King Oberon, very famous fairy. But yeah, that would probably be it. I think that, do you guys have anything else that you wanted to add?
There is what's interesting in German. So you said Seelie and unseelie, right?
For the Scottish.
Seelie, for the Scottish, right?
Yeah.
In German, though, Seelie means soul.
Oh yeah.
Seelie, like a
Yeah.
soul.
The soul or the unsoul.
The soul.
Yeah.
That's kind of intriguing. Just
very intriguing. Yeah. And that goes back to this sort of like damned or cursed race that are in between the dead and the living. Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's it for us tonight, guys. Thank you to Mike and hold on.
What did I do? What the hell did I just showed
you
up?
were here.
Yeah.
I just showed up and drank a bunch of tequila and beer. What?
That's fine by me. I appreciate
Hanging
it.
out.
Brought the
King of
spirit.
the Lost Boys
Yes.
over here. Just
Yeah,
drinking.
there you go. I like it.
Lost boys.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you to Mike and to Ayla for being my wingmen on this episode. I appreciate you guys as always.
You're welcome.
Yeah. And thank you to Big Mike for tuning in and checking us out. Thanks for your comments, bro. Looking forward to talking to you on Sunday. So thank you so much for supporting us. You're the real one, and we appreciate you. And thank you everybody for tuning in. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Leave us a thumbs up, maybe a subscription would really help us out. And yeah, I think that's going to be it for us tonight, guys. So until next time, you stay out there, and we'll catch you on the next Exofathom. Good night.
Peace.
Stay groovy.
Mm.